Well, we're going to get started today. This is a free parenting webinar, and this is for any parent or caregiver out there. So I just want to take a few minutes and introduce myself. And I do want to let everyone know that not every week we're going to have as long of an introduction because I'm really mindful of your time. And if you're a regular part of the series, you're going to know who I am, and you don't need to hear that repeated information each time. So once again, this is a free parenting webinar series, and we're going to have weekly discussions every Monday at noon Eastern Standard Time. So once you register for the series, it's going to be accessible for you to log in each week. And then we're also going to make sure that we email a recording especially to those people who weren't able to attend live. So the goal is that we create a time where everybody can participate live and get their questions answered real time and be able to participate in the conversation. But I realize people are busy and that can't always work. And so we're going to email it out later, and then you can always give us feedback. So a little bit of information about me is my name is Tara Egan. My training background is that I have a doctorate in school psychology. And so I worked in public schools for a very long time. I also taught as an adjunct professor in the psychology department at 2 different colleges. And then I went back to school and got additional training to be licensed as a mental health clinician. So my licensure is through North Carolina, and I have a private practice located in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I work with children, with adolescents, and with parents. So I do work with kids and families on a variety of issues. Most of the time when people reach out to me, they have a specific concern about at least one of their children. And oftentimes it's something that is impacting their behavior. So it might be kids who are showing temper tantrums, who are struggling with anxiety. Parents feel like they're in a lot of power struggles with their kids, and their home life isn't as peaceful as they'd like it to be. So oftentimes that's why parents are calling, is they're saying that their home life is disrupted. But over the years, I've been in practice I've been a mental health clinician for almost 20 years, is I've developed some specialty areas. So the specialty areas that I focus most on are supporting parents when it comes to managing technology and social media for their children and teens, helping parents navigate through separation or divorce. And for some families, that's really amicable divorces, and parents are co-parenting in a really productive way. Other times it's a high conflict divorce, and parents are really trying to navigate co-parenting when they're going through custody battles, are really struggling to come up with a co-parenting agreement. And then the last area that I do a lot of specialization is anxiety in children and teens. And oftentimes that means helping parents manage their anxiety too, because it's really stressful to have kids who are suffering from anxiety. Another thing I just want to mention is that I am the host of a podcast called One Day You'll Thank Me, and it is a parenting podcast, and episodes are released every Wednesday, and my co-host is actually my teenage daughter. So we are just wrapping up the last few episodes of season 1, and then in November we're going to roll right into season 2, and every week we talk about a different topic that is relatable to parents in a general sense, and we do some really fantastic guest expert interviews. So we've had professionals on who've talked about things like eating disorders, how to support kids in preventing porn addiction, sensory issues, managing. This episode coming up this week is talking about virtual learning, and we're going to introduce that topic today. So let's get started. Roll down here. All right. So today we're going to talk about 3 tips for successful virtual learning. And so those 3 tips, and we're going to cover each of them, is attitude, communication, and trust. So we're going to start with attitude. And I'm going to share a little bit of background information about what I've been seeing from my clients over the last month or so. I'm located in Charlotte, North Carolina, so our kids have been back to school for about a month. Some kids have been in it even longer than that, depending on if they're going to a public school or a private school. And I'm seeing that in my work, that attitude, and when I say attitude, I don't even just mean from the students, but also from the parents, is really impacting whether or not virtual learning is successful within that home. So I think we all understand that for most students, virtual learning is not ideal, especially for the younger kids. We are raised in a culture where we are very encouraging of student-teacher interaction, kids using manipulatives, kids working in small groups and having a lot of peer influence and interaction. And there's so much of that feels missing right now in the virtual learning experience. So we understand that it's not ideal for most students. However, it is the reality for so many of us. And so we kind of have to put our best effort towards having a positive interaction with virtual learning as a whole, and having kids understand that their mindset is going to impact their motivation, it's going to impact their sense of competence and their stamina when it comes to getting through the virtual learning process. So I have this diagram on this slide, and it just talks about this is the diagram that you're going to see me use it in other presentations too, because it talks about the relationship between what we think about and how that relates to how we feel, and then in turn how that influences our behavior. So if we have the thought that teachers are working hard, teachers want us to do well, then our emotions are going to correspond to feeling hopeful, feeling encouraged, feeling like we can connect with our teachers and they're going to be helpful and responsive. And then from there, our behavior is more likely to be positive and pro-social. Kids are more likely to advocate for themselves, ask questions, feel as though they are going to get a positive learning experience throughout the year. So when kids are talking about virtual learning or they're going through the experience, they're going to look to their parents for cues. And my kids are both doing full-time virtual learning. In fact, they're doing it right now. And I had to tell them to take a break from checking in with me for the next 45 minutes or so. But for me, as a parent, I focus on the fact that my kids have accessibility to their teachers. We have the privilege to have the technology that they need. We have good, solid teachers. They have a lot of great peer role models. And that my children feel that I am very hopeful about this process. And I speak in an encouraging way about it. I talk positively about their teachers. And in fact, my son sent me a text earlier, about 15 minutes before this started, and he said, I did get Google Forms wrong. I was supposed to click on an answer twice in order for it to register, but I only clicked on it once. And somehow the answer it looked like I didn't answer the questions, and I got a 25%. And he felt very despairing about these assignments. And so I said, hey, reach out to your teacher, ask the question. She doesn't want you to fail. She totally wants to make this work for you. And he was he came in and he was feeling very upset. And by the time he left the room, he was like, all right, I can do this. And he sent her a really respectful email. And now we're just waiting to see how she responds. But because I conveyed the attitude of this can be worked out and your teacher wants you to do well just as much as you want to do well, then that kept him in a calm place so he can go back into the next class. So it's important for parents to have the thought that most students are capable of participating in virtual learning successfully. And that's true. I work with dozens and dozens of kids over the course of a month, and I'm seeing the vast majority of kids with support are having a generally successful experience. And so I do want parents to understand that if that's not the case for your child, then there is help out there. And if parents are interested, then that might be a good topic of discussion next time we meet for this parenting webinar series. And then the last thing I want to point out about attitude is there are benefits that kids are going to gain from participating in virtual learning. And a couple of those benefits that I can think of right off the bat are kids are going to learn to initiate tasks, in that there is a more independence is expected during this. So kids are going to be supported in the process of being a task initiator. I think kids are going to learn to advocate for themselves more because they're going to have to speak up. They're going to have to ask questions. They're going to have to send emails because the teacher isn't walking around the classroom checking in with each student individually like they might do if it was in-person learning. And also, too, is this online learning process is very common in work environments and college environments. So this is practice. This is practice that they will benefit from later as they go through their educational career. The next thing I want to talk about is communication. And there's really three important types of communication. One is with your child. The second one is with your child's teachers. And the third one is with your co-parent. And when I say co-parent, I mean anybody you're co-parenting with. It could be a partner that lives in the house with you. It could be somebody that you're separated or divorced from, or it could be even a grandparent who's helping with childcare or things like that. But when it comes to communication with your child, it's really important to convey what your expectations are and let them know if there's going to be consequences built in if they don't meet those expectations. So you might say to your child, I expect you to, be there on time when your virtual learning class starts. I expect you to make sure that you don't have any more than 1 to 2 missing assignments at any given time. And I expect you to, make a list every day of the tasks you have to do. And for each child and each family, it's going to look different. So in my house, my kids are expected, obviously, to be there on time. And they are expected to get up on their own with an alarm and make sure that they eat breakfast. And they are expected to have no more than 2 missing assignments. And if they have a missing assignment, they're expected to email the teacher to figure out what they can do to resolve it, whether it's extra credit, whether they're able to turn in the assignment late, even if it's for reduced points. And then they also know what the consequence is if they're not holding up their end of the deal. So for my son, his pain point is the Xbox. So he understands that if his grades dip a little bit lower, then that means he probably needs to focus more on school and have less opportunity for fun activities online. Okay. So the next thing I want to mention is communicating with your child's teachers. And as I'm working with students right now over the last few weeks, I'm learning that parents can be very hesitant to send an email. They can feel like they're bothering the teacher. Sometimes they have a little bit of trust issues that maybe their child isn't presenting the information accurately, so they sort of don't want to say something and look as though they're ill-informed when they have a question. Sometimes parents can get intimidated by the process of approaching the school. But I want to assure you that teachers, they don't want to get an email from you every day questioning every little thing. They don't have time for that. But teachers are interested in what your perspective is of their child's learning experience. So if your child's really struggling, if they're really anxious, if they feel overwhelmed, if they feel understimulated, if they're confused by directions, those are all things that teachers want to know so they can continue to modify their materials, directions, assignments so that it suits the students. So sometimes an assignment doesn't translate well from in-person learning to virtual learning, and teachers don't know that unless kids and parents communicate with them. So already in the last month to 6 weeks that I've been working with students, I've seen a lot of teachers course correct as they've gotten input from parents. So especially in elementary school, because those are parents who are more likely to communicate with their child's teachers. And I have not had an experience yet that has been negative when parents have reached out to teachers. So that's a really important piece to this, is making sure that communication with teachers is positive, frequent enough to be meaningful, and is just really responsive to your individual child. And then the last type of communication that I want to bring up is just communicating with your co-parent. So that's just making sure your kids are not getting mixed messages about what's expected of the learning process. So if you have one parent who is very hands-off, isn't checking in, is really relying on kids to be independent, but then the other parent is hovering, nagging, fussing, asking a million questions, kids can get confused by this. really irritated by this, and they can feel undermined by the parent who is doing the fussing. So it's really important that parents, that co-parents have a united front in the type of approach that they're going to use with their child. And just to obviously be responsive to your child. Some kids need more support and they need more cueing, and other kids are doing quite well when they're working more independently. But this goes back to that communication and consistency for kids. Is it impacts their experience and their level of initiation and competence. So those are some things to think about when it comes to communication. When it comes to trust, so all parents have a history with their kids as far as how they've done academically. So you might have a history with your child where every year feels like a fight. Your child needs so much prompting and support. Their grades will tank, and then they have a hard time digging themselves out of that hole. So I don't want to discount that. However, if you have that appropriate communication, and I mentioned that earlier in this presentation, and you create a plan together where you collaborate and say, okay, what's the expectations? What's your plan for meeting these expectations? And really feel like you have a give and take and you've listened to each other to say to your child, well, this is what I'm concerned about. And they say, well, this is what I want to do, or this is what I think is right for me. And of course, we have to account for the fact that kids do a lot of maturing over the summer. So sometimes what they couldn't handle back last January is something that they can handle more now. But you want to create that plan and collaborate with them and trust that they're going to be able to implement at least some of the things that they've stated. And then let them try it. And you might give them a period of time that they can work independently or do whatever the plan is that you came up with. So you might say, all right, well, let's check on this in 2 weeks. You don't want to wait so long that they've struggled academically and have fallen behind and feel really discouraged and overwhelmed. But you also don't want to give them, 2 days and then they feel like they really didn't have a chance to work things out. And I have to tell you, I was a little guilty of this myself when I have a 10th grade daughter, and when she started the school year, she was really overwhelmed. She is a straight A student, and she is quite organized and meticulous in her work. And she was spending hours and hours on it. And so I started to get frustrated and concerned because I felt like she didn't have balance. She wasn't being efficient with her time. And I started to get involved. And she said, Mom, give me a few days to get this sorted out. Let me know my teachers. Let me get feedback on my assignments to see what they expect. And just let me figure this out for a few days. And she was going to go to her dad's for a week, and then she was going to come back. So she's like, when I get back from dad's, if I haven't sorted it out, then we'll have another conversation. And so even though I wanted to be interfering and let's create a plan, and let's talk about what our strategies are, it really was important for me to check in and recognize, like, she deserved my trust in this. She deserved a chance to follow through with what she said she was going to do. And I would say she's met 80%, if not 90% of what she said she was going to do by giving her the opportunity to work it out. So, if it doesn't work out, then it's okay to move to plan B. And you might say, all right, you can try this for a couple weeks, but if it doesn't work for you after a couple weeks, then we're going to move to this other strategy. And you can get their agreement and their commitment to try that strategy when things are calm, when they haven't been unsuccessful at something and maybe feel emotional. And then you can go ahead and say, all right, we tried it your way. It's not quite working out. What do we need to adjust to make it work better? And have them understand, like, it's okay to course correct. Like, that is being responsible and thoughtful and using problem solving skills. That's not they're in trouble because they disappointed you. It's really important for them to get into that problem solving space when they're struggling with something. So three things we talked about today. We talked about attitude, communication, and trust. Okay, and so what I want to do is make sure that we have time to ask questions during this session. But before we do that, I just want to encourage everyone to recognize that these parenting webinar series are meant to be brief. 15, 20 minutes of conversation and discussion and information sharing from me, and then some question and answer portions. And if you have suggestions for topics that you want to be discussed, please email us. The email address is drtaraegan@gmail.com. And if you know you can't be here live, it is very appropriate for you to email questions prior to the webinar. And as long as we have time, we're going to make sure that we prioritize them. And then also, I wanted to let you know there's another resource. It's a private Facebook group called Adolescence, a Parent's Guide, a support group for high school parents. So this is a group for parents and caregivers who have high school students or kids who will be soon to be high school students. So we have some parents who have like 7th and 8th graders, and they're thinking ahead to how they can best prepare them for high school. And so there's a lot of resources available in that group, as well as conversations and support between parents. And then the last thing I want to mention before we get to question and answer is that I do have that podcast, as I mentioned, and we have the weekly episodes, and they're somewhere usually between 30 minutes and 45 minutes in length. And the episode that is coming out this Wednesday, which is in 2 days, there's going to be more information about virtual learning, and it's completely separate from the information I'm presenting today. So keep that in mind. If you're listening to this later and you didn't have a question answered, tune into that episode and you might learn whatever it is that you need to know. Okay, so what do you think?
Awesome, Tara.
Do we have any questions?
Yeah, we have a question here from Pete, and he says, my 10th grader's grades fluctuate a lot throughout the semester. Sometimes she'll learn 40% on something, other times 100%. She always manages to end up with an A or B by the end of the semester. Should I get involved to help her make better choices, or just let her figure it out on her own?
Okay, so this is a really great question, and right in line with what we talked about today, which is if you're seeing that that's a pattern with your child and the stress that it causes. And by stress, I don't just mean your stress as a parent, because it's really not about us. I mean, we have the role or the job of managing our own stress. Our kids shouldn't have to do that. But if what's happening is if your child's grades kind of tank, they go up and down, they're high and then they're low, and they're digging themselves out of this hole, and they're crying, they're upset, they're panicking, they're staying up really late to scramble. Like, the stress level in that circumstance is way too high. And so it's really important to give her some support at that point so she doesn't get to that state of panic. If kids are able to take it in stride and they say, all right, I had a low grade in there. Let me email my teacher. Let me figure out what I can do to solve this problem. And I'm learning in this process that so many kids are having these grades that are due to technology issues, because we're still learning, including the teachers. And there's times where kids are turning in an assignment and it's complete, and then somehow it's not showing up or it's not automatically grading. So we don't want to freak out too much and blame our kids and immediately go on to kind of attack mode of like, you're failing, or you have a terrible grade in there and what happened? But I really encourage you to look at the big picture, which is your child showing competence in this class? And if they're ending up with an A or a B, there is a lot of competence that's being shown there. And what their anxiety level is. Like I said, it's not a sustainable behavior if it's causing a lot of angst and drama and sleepless nights. But if your child's able to take it in stride and problem solve in a relatively calm way, then I think in that circumstance, you could step back and let them work out that problem. They're showing some really good problem solving skills in that situation. And you can do a little support. You can do a little collaboration of how not to get into that situation where there's some really lousy grades in there. And sometimes you can look for patterns. If it's, gosh, every quiz they tank because they're not doing enough prep for tests and quizzes, that might be a place that you can support them. Or if you're seeing that they're getting zeros because they're turning in things late, well, maybe they need some help creating their list of things to do. And that might be a way that you can support them. But I wouldn't look at it as they are in trouble and it should be a discipline thing, especially if they're able to pull up that grade up to meet your expectations by the end of the semester.
Awesome, Tara. Thank you. Next question is, my 11th grader does virtual learning full time. he uses a school Chromebook, but he's always looking at his phone during class. Should I take it away? Or he's not paying attention. What do you have to say about that?
This is really, so a couple relevant things here. One of the relevant points is that he's an 11th grader. So if we were talking about a 5th grader or even a 7th grader, then my answer could be a little different because they're in such a different place developmentally. With 11th grader, we have a child who's 2 years away from college, where they're going to have complete freedom with their technology devices. And, there's going to be a sharp learning curve if they haven't had a chance to work this out on their own. So my first thing I want to point out is because this child is older, it really might be important for them to see what the consequence of being on their phone is. So if it's super distracting and it ends up causing their grades to dip, then this is a good lesson to learn. They don't need to learn it for weeks and weeks and have failing grades, but you might, as the parent, be able to cue them of, look at, here's a variable that is impacting your grades. This is a distraction for you, and so you need to choose differently. And this might be something where you say, all right, I'm going to let you make this choice. But after a couple weeks, if your grades are not meeting expectations, then this is going to be one of the strategies we're going to use to see if it makes a difference. So that way they have a chance to prove to you that having their phone at their fingertips isn't really a detriment to them. And also, too, is it is important to have a discussion of what they're using it for. Because I know with my 10th grader, she has multiple screens. She has a monitor that has her notes on it. She has her Chromebook that has the lecture or the notes from the teacher. And then she has sometimes another screen with, an assignment, a worksheet pulled up. And I know there's times she's doing some texting with a peer to work out a problem together. So in that situation, she's really using that phone as a tool to support her learning. Whereas if she's, on TikTok, then, not so much. So some of it is just keep that in mind of what they're using it for. Oh, one last thing I want to say. If you've got a really young kid, I would probably discourage this.
Awesome. So it's about communicating the consequences, and that's
right. And seeing what the how it's manifesting, like what's happening due to this. Is it causing, failure or distraction or stress? And also, if the teacher points out to you that your child is not being attentive, that's obviously a clue that it's not appropriate to have during that time.
That's a good one. My sister tends to be very overactive, and this is very hard for her, which is actually in line with one of our next questions. And what advice do you have for children with ADHD with regards to virtual learning in terms of keeping them on track for assignments, work delivery, and paying attention in class?
So a lot of this is a really good question, and this would also be a good topic to discuss in its own webinar. Children with ADHD or any kind of educational disability that impacts their, any child who's neuroatypical. So just a couple tips to think about is it does matter, once again, the child's age and what types of supports they've received for their ADHD. For kids who've received counseling services, who've used medication, who've really been educated on their ADHD and the characteristics associated with them, then you can have a much more problem-solving and strategy-focused conversation because they might be aware of what their weaknesses are. They might be aware that they're easily distracted or they need to incorporate movement into their day, that they need to have more organizational strategies. For me, I don't have ADHD. It's not particularly hard for me to keep an ongoing list of activities in my head and not have to write it down. But if I had any kind of attentional weaknesses, that would be something that would have to be very clearly part of my day. So a couple things is, have them collaborate with you on what type of organizational strategy they want to use, whether it's a whiteboard that's stuck to the wall that they write things down on, whether they use their phone or technology to create lists, whether they have what materials they have on hand. Some kids are super cluttered and disorganized, and it's all just a big mess, and they benefit from having a very clean work surface. Other people need to have some tools right on hand, whether it's sticky notes or, things they can color on to keep something, their hands moving so that they can attend with their, mental energy. And then also too is talking about their need for breaks, because kids with ADHD have a much higher level of mental fatigue. They get fatigued much quicker than a person who doesn't have ADHD. So to recognize that, as the parent, as well as the child recognizing that within themselves, we have to adjust our expectation as far as how long they can persist with a task that's very taxing. So it is really, if your child is mentally fatigued, there's no amount of scolding them or prompting them that's going to make them stop being mentally fatigued. They need a break. And so they need to pace themselves. There's a couple students I work with where they sort of, if they have attentional difficulties, they'll sort of fluctuate between operating between like 40% sometimes, and then other times they have to gear it up to like 120% just to pedal faster and sort of tread water. So I try to encourage those kids, like, let's see if we can have you operate on 70 to 80% pretty consistently, where you're tuned in enough to benefit from the instruction, but you're not so, engrossed that you're maxing out your stamina really, really early in the day. So, and if you have a child with ADHD, it's going to be really important that the older they get, the more they understand that diagnosis so they can advocate for themselves.
Good. I know my sister doesn't have ADHD, but she does struggle a lot with, having the attention that she needs for her class. But she's used to like so many activities, she used to be in tennis, she used to be in orchestra, she used to be in so many activities that kept her attention, stimulated, not just like sitting down. And she's confessed to me it's been a struggle since she started. But she's also the type of person that's very independent. Very independent because my mom is working and I try to help her out, and so she doesn't communicate as much. And what you said about like communicating with your kid, but also with the school, if she's not communicating with us, for example, how well she's doing, it's important to keep an active role as well. But yeah, trying to give this really gives me an insight as well, even for my sister.
Well, and knowing what, if kids can know themselves well enough to feel when their stamina is sinking. So my son does not have ADHD, but he is very active. And so there's times when he's doing sit-ups between classes and push-ups to just kind of like get his energy level back. There's times when he has fidgets in his hands. There's times when I've even told him, like, you can even have like an adult coloring book next to you so that you have something to do with your hands so you can be tuning in to what you're listening to. I encourage kids to take notes. And I don't even mean to take notes because they're going to study them later, but just the process of being able to hear and writing down some key words sometimes is enough to keep them engaged versus just tuning out and being distracted. So, but those strategies can feel like work or can feel like nagging when you tell a student you have to do it this way. The best way to do it is to really collaborate and try out some things with them so they understand what works for them, because they feel better when they're being successful. Like, that's ultimately what we want them to feel, is hopeful and successful. And whatever strategy they need to use to feel that way is going to benefit them. So it needs to be collaborative. But chances are these are students who are going to need to have really specific strategies. They're not going to be able to just kind of wing it.
That's awesome. Thank you. And last question we have here. My kid never turns on her camera during her virtual learning classes. She says no one does. Should I make her do it anyway?
Okay, so this is also a really good question. Now, I've been learning in my process of working with kids over the last few weeks is there's some schools who really, really encourage kids to turn on their camera, or the teachers will even insist on it. And there's other schools where they don't insist on it, or even in fact say that it's a breach of confidentiality within students' homes. So some of it is you just have to figure out what your school policy is first, because kids have to follow those rules. And then the second thing is recognize that when it comes to kids and teens, peer pressure is so much to be the only kid who has their camera on, or one of the only kids who has their camera on, is a huge hurdle that's probably unrealistic for them to overcome. They're not going to want to be the one who sticks out and have the entire class looking at their image when everybody else has a dark screen. So even though I think having kids keep their camera on can help them with attention and engagement, I also understand that from their perspective, the amount of anxiety or self-consciousness they might have if they're one of the only ones is probably going to be a huge distraction. So it's really important to go back to that early communication to convey what your expectations are of, okay, even if your camera's off, that doesn't mean that you're, wandering away from the camera. That doesn't mean that you're not taking notes or looking at the presentation notes as the teacher's speaking. That doesn't mean that you're laying down with the blanket over your face. There's a lot of kids who are trying to do virtual learning laying in their beds. Not a good plan. There's almost nobody who's going to be engaged in learning when they haven't changed into fresh clothes. They're in a laying down position, and, basically it's easier to do everything else more than it's, easy to do virtual learning. So there's some things you can do to help kids be engaged in the process and have them take it seriously and be in the mindset of student and learning without making them turn on the camera. So that's one of those things. Discuss it with your kids, and you can even check in with the teacher to see what the teacher's expectation is. And if the teacher's like, well, 75% of kids are turning on the camera, I really feel like your student isn't engaged in the classroom, I really would like him or her to turn on their camera, then you might need to be more insistent with it. But there's a couple things to check into first before you get to that point.
Mm-hmm. Very good, Dr. Egan. Thank you so much for that. There is one question, and regarding specifically the information that we have on the screen right now. Is there a similar Facebook group for parents with middle schoolers? Can you clarify?
There is. There's a great Facebook group called Less Stressed Middle School Parents. And it is a Facebook group that is hosted or run by Michelle Icard, who's another professional that I believe is located here in Charlotte. So she started her original middle school group, and then some parents were asking about whether or not that group could be extended into high school. So I was like, hey, let's take advantage of this enthusiasm by parents. And so we just started our high school group. So I really encourage you, if you have a middle schooler, to check out that Facebook group, Less Stressed Middle School Parents. It's got like 6,000 parents in it. It's got wonderful resources. So that's a great question.
Awesome. Well, I think we are good in time and with the questions. And just to remind everybody, you can send any questions also through drtaraegan@gmail.com, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as well, you can visit the website, and there's a lot of information there that they can get, and also send some questions through the website itself.
Right. So we haven't completely decided on what the topic is going to be next week. I was originally thinking about discussing tips to manage anxiety in children. However, if you have input that, would be helpful for us in deciding which topics to prioritize, then we are going to be responsive to the audience. Because once again, this is about you. It's not about me. And if you join my regular Facebook page, I don't necessarily mean the private Facebook page, but just the Dr. Tara Egan page. I'm going to give some information on those pages about the upcoming topics each week so that you can decide, how you want to prioritize your schedule as far as participating live.
Great. Well, so many insights. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Randy did say yes to anxiety topics.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Okay, well, good. And I think that's such a great topic. And during time of COVID and kids going back to school, I think it's fantastic. I think everybody could benefit. So I will initially plan on that unless I hear differently. Okay.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kerrigan, for being with us and for answering so many of our questions and doubts. I think we're good for today, right?
Okay. Well, thanks, Nick.
Yeah.
I appreciate your help in making sure this is recorded, and we will send out the recordings as soon as we get them prepared. All right. Bye, everyone.